Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by Snickers. Rookie mistake, maybe you just need a Snickers. I'm Jamie, that's Dave. Joining us now, it's our buddy Heath Cummings, and we're talking about the waiver wire options at quarterback and running back for you for Week 16. And obviously, the quarterback position has been decimated by injuries, as we're not expected to have Jalen Hurts. We're waiting to find out if Lamar Jackson's going to come back. You know Kyler Murray's out for the season with the ACL tear, and here are the guys that you could be looking at as options. Now, really, the first two guys are quarterbacks you can use in the majority of leagues. The rest of the list is more super flex, 2 quarterback leagues, 14-team, 16-team league. You're desperate, but Heath Cummings, Gardner Minshew is back as a starting quarterback in 2022. Your favorite quarterback of all time, 3% roster, taking on the Cowboys. The floor is yours. What will Gardner do this week?
I've got him projected for 22 fantasy points, which is exactly what he scored in Week 13 last year when he got to play with the starters. Now, I think if you just look at his career, he's been a low-end number 1, high-end number 2 for almost the entirety of his career. And he's never been able to play with a cast like this, with A.J. Brown, with Devontae Smith, with Dallas Goedert. I would expect that he is going to be a top 10 quarterback. There are 4 quarterbacks all playing against each other this week who I have in that 8 to 12 range, who I'm struggling with how to rank. It's Minshew, it's Cousins, it's Prescott, and it's Daniel Jones. Those 4 guys are the low-end starters, and I feel pretty confident in all of them.
Since you weren't with us at the start of the show, what do you think Minshew's starting does for the receiving core there in Philadelphia?
I think it lowers things just a little bit for A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. If I remember correctly, last year, Minshew's only start with Dallas Goedert was also the only time that Dallas Goedert got into the end zone after Jalen Hurts took over as a quarterback. He had 2 touchdowns in that game. So I think Goedert will be fine as a starter. Brown and Smith both pretty close to must-start number 2 wide receivers in that wide receiver 15 to 18 range. I think the efficiency might be a little bit worse, but there will be more pass volume because there won't be as many designed quarterback runs.
And for those of you wondering why Heath is not with us in studio today, it's because he was stalking Gardner Minshew, as he typically does. As you see here, he was trying to find wherever Gardner Minshew is to maybe recreate this photo. So Heath is a big Gardner Minshew fan, as we all are, so it could be fun to see Minshew perform this week against the Cowboys. And let's keep in mind, he could be honoring his former college coach, Mike Leach, who recently passed away. So that could be a fun way to celebrate Mike Leach's life by Gardner Minshew having a big game against the Cowboys. Dave, you said Brock Purdy, somebody that you would consider starting this week, and it's been fun to see how he's performed for the last 3 games, but the last 2 starts. Can he have another good game against what might be his toughest competition so far against the Washington Commanders defense that's been pretty good against quarterbacks?
Definitely his toughest competition, but still not a matchup that's going to be so terrible that he can't get you to that 18 to 20 fantasy point range. And he's basically been there. His 3 games that he's played, 18, 25, and 20 fantasy points. They're doing a good job in San Francisco of scheming things up. He's not going to wow you with a bunch of deep throws. He's gotten a little lucky with some of the defensive coverage that he's taken advantage of, but hey, he took advantage of it. That's what a good quarterback does, and I really like the way he keeps plays alive with his legs. So I think he's good. If you can't get your hands on Gardner Minshew, he's the next guy that you could pick up off the waiver wire and use ahead of guys like Zach Wilson and Ryan Tannehill.
Would you start him over Tom Brady this week?
I would not, because I actually like the matchup for Brady against the Cardinals.
Would you start him over Aaron Rodgers this week?
I've gone back and forth between them. I think I might.
And what about Derek Carr?
I am staying away from Derek Carr this week on the road against Pittsburgh. That's a bad matchup.
Heath, you feel the same way about Purdy? Can you have an opportunity to be a top 12 quarterback this week, or are you going to stick with the same thing you've been saying, that the pass attempts are a little bit concerning?
The pass attempts are a little bit concerning, but I think the other thing, it's not just the quarterback injuries. We have some absolutely awful weather this week as well. Deshaun Watson may be playing in 50-mile-per-hour winds. And you mentioned Derek Carr. We've talked about his cold weather struggles in the past. That game's supposed to have a high of 11 in Pittsburgh. And so I would start Purdy over Derek Carr. He's a high-end number 2 quarterback. I think he has the possibility of being a top 12 guy, but if he is, that will probably mean a couple of our top 12 guys faltered.
We don't usually talk about guys that are available in less than 30 or 65% of leagues, that are available in 35% of leagues or fewer. But Daniel Jones has been dropped in a lot of leagues. He's at 83% rostered right now. You mentioned his name, Heath, before about somebody you're struggling with. It's a great matchup against Minnesota. His production's really been all over the place lately. 9 fantasy points last week against Washington. Again, give credit to the Commanders' defense. But can Daniel Jones have maybe a top 10 performance this week against that Minnesota defense?
Yeah, he is right there with Gardner Minshew for me. If they were both available on the waiver wire, I would have a hard time choosing. I'd probably choose Minshew because he's Gardner Minshew. But yeah, I think he could actually be better than Kirk Cousins in this game. The question is, how much do they have him on design runs and how many pass attempts does he get to throw? I think the Vikings score enough in this game that he could be at 30, 35 pass attempts. He could run the ball for 40 or 50 yards. I think he could be a top 12 guy for sure.
Be interesting to see how the Giants defense shows up, maybe impacting what Daniel Jones has to do from an offensive perspective. All right, so Dave, if you're taking away Gardner Minshew, you're taking away Brock Purdy, and let's say Daniel Jones is not available.
Oh, you're going to make me
your
say
favorite
it.
desperation quarterback.
You're going to make me say Zach Wilson, and it is Zach Wilson. Number one, because he is willing to throw the ball deep. Number two, because I think he is going to have a lot of pass snaps. And number three, it's a pretty good matchup for him against the Jacksonville Jaguars. 8 of the last 9 quarterbacks to take on the Jags have put up at least 21 fantasy points. Wilson had 22 fantasy points against the Lions. So he's going from one of the best matchups a quarterback could have to another really good matchup. And now he's doing it with a week's worth of work under his belt. No surprises about who's going to start. I don't love that it's on a short week, but I think that Zach Wilson can be decent for fantasy managers. Just be aware that he could also completely melt down and give you 5 fantasy.
The one thing you could potentially hope for, which would not be a surprise, is the Jaguars offense showing up. Trevor Lawrence putting up a big, point total for Jacksonville, and maybe the Jets chasing points if their defense does not show up. So that could put Zach Wilson in a situation like we saw against the Patriots earlier this season, where he threw for 300 yards, 2 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, but another 20-point day for him as well. Heath, your favorite desperation guy is?
Absolutely Zach Wilson, and I would start him over Derek Carr this week. So I'm not even quite saying he's desperation. He's a top 18 quarterback for me. He's right there with Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers. I slightly prefer them right now, but they're in the same ballpark.
All right, so here we go.
Yeah.
Zach Wilson, Gardner Minshew, Brock Purdy. Good luck for you if you're in your fantasy semifinals having to start those guys in a 1-quarterback league. Let's transition now to the running backs, and we know the big story again. Jonathan Taylor expected to be placed on injured reserve. We're not going to see him in Week 16 for sure. So Zach Moss and Deion Jackson, we don't exactly know who is expected to be the lead guy. We have our inclination that's going to be Zach Moss based on what happened in the game against Minnesota when Taylor got hurt. Tyler Allgeier's coming off a career-high performance for him against the Saints. Chuba Hubbard's in a good spot from a pass-catching standpoint, although a brutal matchup against the Lions. Royce Freeman, another name that we thought we'd never be talking about, the lead running back now for the Texans, then a couple of backup running backs in Jordan Mason and Marlon Mack. So let's talk about the Colts here, Dave. So Jonathan Taylor, again, likely out for the season, but certainly out for Week 16. Chargers are number 5 in terms of most fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. Moss, you see here, was the lead running back for the majority of the game after Taylor got hurt, but Jackson scored the touchdown. He was the better running back earlier this season when there was no Jonathan Taylor as well. So who's the best one for fantasy managers to go get?
I'm going to lean towards Zach Moss, but I don't feel good about it. I don't feel good about either of these guys, and I fully expect them to both work in tandem with each other. It is a great matchup against the Chargers. There's no question about it, but this is still a struggling Indianapolis offense, and these are 2 running backs that when they've actually carried the ball have been pretty inefficient. The one who's been better on the season catching the football has been Deion Jackson, but even he didn't have that big of a role on 3rd downs in the game last week against Minnesota. I'd be nervous about starting either one of these guys.
Heath, what's your take on this? Can you trust either one of these Colts running backs against the Chargers?
No, none of these guys are inside of my top 35 running backs. I'd like to stay away from them. I think there's mystery in terms of how they distribute the touches, and there's a chance that none of them average better than 3.5 yards per carry. So if you can stay away, I would like to. But if I have to choose one, I'm definitely choosing Zach Moss.
The one thing about it, though, for the Colts, Adam Azer, our podcast host, noted this, that since Jeff Saturday has taken over, they've been so run-heavy. You're getting 27 carries on average for the games that Saturday has coached. So, and they've been in basically every game for the first 3 quarters. We know what they were doing against the Vikings, a 33-point lead at halftime. So they've been competitive. They're going to lean on their ground game. And Moss had almost every touch that you want. He had the short yardage touches. He actually played more on longer down and distance touches. Neither guy was involved in the passing game, so you're going to potentially get an empty stat line if neither scores here. So I think that's the best way to do it. Is if you can avoid it, avoid it. But Zach Moss is, I think, clearly the better of the 2 based on how they use both of these guys in the game against Minnesota. Tyler Allgeier, Heath, you said on Monday's show, believe it or not, that he's going to be the guy for the Falcons, or he could be the guy for the Falcons in 2023. Does he have an opportunity against Baltimore to maybe A, distance himself from Cordarrelle Patterson, and B, somebody you can rely on even in a tough matchup against Baltimore?
Yeah, I think he has a chance to distance himself, and he has a chance to possibly get into the end zone, but he'll have to get into the end zone because this Baltimore run defense has been so spectacular this season. If it wasn't for the awful matchup, Allgeier would be easily my favorite over the Colts running backs, just because I think he has more potential as a runner. He might actually be kind of good at football. But that matchup is awful, so he's slightly behind Zach Moss, but ahead of Deion Jackson for me.
They do get Arizona in Week 16, and so if you are just looking ahead, Week 17. So if you are just looking ahead and you think, hey, I'm going to win, I'm getting to the fantasy championship, Allgeier could be somebody that might be a flex option if he comes out of the Baltimore game playing better than Cordarrelle Patterson, and even if he has a big stat line. Dave, you said on our podcast that you would take Chuba Hubbard as the number 1 running back this week. Now, he's in an interesting spot because the Lions' run defense has been amazing since Week 8. they haven't allowed a running back to go over 10 PPR points.
It's true.
And you like Hubbard still the best.
I like him better than Deontay Foreman this week, and it's only in full PPR that I like him better than everybody else on this list. But look at the next two matchups for Carolina. It's against the Lions. It's against Tampa Bay. These are two good run defenses. I think it's a death knell on Deontay Foreman. I can't trust him moving forward. I might even consider cutting him. Hopefully someone I'm playing picks him up, starts him, and they get nothing out of him. Chuba Hubbard's been playing more when the Panthers have been down. He's also been the one that catches more passes. I think in full PPR, he's got a shot to hit that 10 PPR mark against the Lions this week.
It's going to be tough, I think. You see what the stat line was last week with 3 catches. He only has 3 targets each of those 2 games as well. So unless they change, I think, the way they approach it, it could still be a game like 9, maybe 10 tops. So yes, he's better than Deontay Foreman, but I don't know if he's better than the Colts guys, or at least the opportunity for Zach Moss. Heath, you get the fun conversation. Royce Freeman, any interest knowing that he's the lead running back for the Texans now, at least coming off the first game without Dameon Pierce, who's on IR?
No, because he's the lead running back who's probably not going to catch very many passes against an awful matchup against the Titans defense that really the only way running backs have been good at them for the most part has been in the passing game. So he is behind these top 3 guys, more of a similar situation to Zach Moss in a worse situation because of the matchup. I would like to stay away from Royce Freeman. He's around RB 40-ish for me. I think you're probably going to get somewhere in the 6 to 8 fantasy point range.
Really interesting just to see how the Texans have stayed competitive the last 2 weeks against the Cowboys and the Chiefs. And they do it against the Titans, who are on a 4-game losing streak, and that'll probably determine how well Royce Freeman plays. But again, the reason he's last is because you're talking about a desperation play. All right, we're going to take a break right now. We come back and get into the wide receiver and tight end waiver wire options for you. And a couple of Titans are on this list. Traylon Burks at wide receiver, Chigo Okonkwo at the tight end position. Can you trust them against the Texans? We'll talk about that next on FFT. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by Snickers. Rookie mistake, maybe you just need a Snickers. I'm Jamie, that's Dave, that's Heath. We're looking at the wide receiver and tight end waiver wire options for you for Week 16. And not exactly a list of guys you're going to find for starting options at the wide receiver position, but certainly some guys that can add some depth and maybe be number 3 receivers for you if you're stuck for Week 16. We don't know if Traylon Burks is going to play after missing the last 2 games with a concussion, but my gosh, could he be awesome if he does. He was trending in such a high direction prior to getting hurt against Philadelphia in Week 13. We would just love to see him finish the season strong. Maybe not against Houston in Week 16, but good opportunity for the final 2 weeks of the season. John Dotson's been great the last 2 weeks. Mecole Hardman was great before he got hurt. Chris Moore has 20 targets in his last 2 games. And a lot of these other receivers are in some very good spots for this week. Again, it's just a matter of how much you will trust him. So let's start with Traylon Burks. And so Dave, again, coming off the concussion, we hope to see him play against the Texans. Now, I do think that the numbers in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing receivers from Houston is a little bit of a myth. They are number 3 in fewest fantasy points allowed to the position. They might not have Stingley or Nelson, their top 2 cornerbacks. Again, they didn't play last week against the Chiefs. Can Burks, if he plays, be somebody that you would rely on?
I'd rely on him as a number 3 receiver, but it's with a warning, Jamie. We've seen in the past 4 times that Derrick Henry's played against Houston, he's run for over 200 yards and a ton of touchdowns along the way. And I went back and I saw how often did Houston actually see pass attempts from the Titans in those games. The Titans passed 10, 20, 27, 41 times. One of those things is not like the other. Deshaun Watson was playing for Houston. Defense was apparently optional that day, and it was a huge back and forth game. Everybody was amazing. But most of the time, obviously, under 30 pass attempts. That gets me a little bit worried about Burks if he plays, especially in his first game back.
It'd be interesting to see, and it'll impact Chigo Okonkwo, who we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. Heath, when it comes to Jahan Dotson, he's been fantastic the last 2 games with over 15 fantasy points in both of those games, but he's got a brutal matchup this week against the 49ers. The flip side of that, though, is we could see maybe Washington throwing more if they're chasing points. They like to rely on their ground game, as we've seen with Brian Robinson and Antonio Gibson. So what's your interest level in Jahan Dotson for this matchup?
He's definitely in that desperation flex conversation and probably has more upside than anyone in that conversation because of how wildly efficient he's been in terms of getting into the end zone and what he's done when he's received targets. The problem is he got 6 targets in this game, and that was a big deal because he hardly ever gets 6 targets. So it's hard to trust unless the pass attempts just go crazy for Taylor Heinicke, and it might be because they might not be able to run against the 49ers at all. I like him a lot as someone that you're desperate. You don't have anybody to start at wide receiver 3 or flex, and you're like, who do I see on the waiver wire that could give me a big game? That's him, but there's no floor at all.
The thing about it is 6 targets last week, 9 targets the week before. his two big games have come against the same team, both against the Giants. So remember, they had the Giants game bracketing their bye week there. So just something to keep in mind. Obviously, Terry McLaurin's still the #1 guy there. They'll still throw to Curtis Samuel. Are there enough targets to go around against San Francisco? Taylor Heineke probably running for his life. So not necessarily somebody you want to trust, but again, somebody you might want to roster just in case he has another good game. You feel good about that for Week 17. Dave, when it comes to Mecole Hardman, we know he was great prior to getting hurt. He had at least 11 PPR points in 4 games in a row, 5 touchdowns over that span. He was doing a great job for fantasy managers before the abdomen injury. They have a lot of different moving parts in Kansas City with what Jerick McKinnon's doing now. Obviously, the stars of Kelsey and Juju. Can Hardman be somebody that you would trust if he comes back this week against the Seahawks?
So I'm going to be a little nervous on Hardman because we did see before he got hurt, it was a touchdown in 4 straight games. He was used as a red zone weapon for Kansas City. Didn't even necessarily play every single snap for them. And we've seen Kansas City, when they're bringing somebody back from an injury at wide receiver, they take it easy with them. They don't give them a lot of work in their first game back. So Hardman's one that I'm going to try and add and keep on my bench, potentially use in Week 17, not in Week 16.
Heath, I know you were a little skeptical about Chris Moore, and he did not have a great game, but he did have 8 targets in that game, and now it's 20 targets in his last 2 games. So Brandon Cooks may return. Nico Collins, we don't know his status. Both guys have missed the last 2 weeks. This is a much easier matchup than he has even than what he had last week because the Titans give up the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Are you interested in Chris Moore now or still the same skepticism as you had prior to Week 15?
Yeah, it's funny, and it probably tells something about my process that I'm a little bit more excited about Chris Moore this week than I was last week, and it's because it was a second consecutive week with that type of target involvement, and it's a better matchup against the Titans. But this is entirely dependent on both Nico Collins and Brandon Cooks remaining out. If they are, he would be a high-end #3 wide receiver for me this week, and I would actually like him more than Burks and Hardman just for this week.
Davis Mills looked for him again, just not a big performance, 4 for 42, but 20 targets in 2 games is hard to overlook. The one thing to keep in mind, though, Brandon Cooks did practice a little bit more last week, so he might be trending in the right direction. All right, Dave, we had our first game without Julio Jones in a while, and Russell Gage stepped up with 12 targets, 8 catches, 59 yards, and 2 touchdowns against the Bengals. He has a good matchup this week against the Cardinals. Are you interested in Russell Gage maybe as a #3 receiver?
I would be, and I looked at Russell Gage as somebody who was like a de facto tight end for Tampa Bay, and you can see it in his receptions, 8, that's a lot. He averaged not even a little more than 7 yards per catch. That's a short area target. Tom Brady is focused on those types of guys, and you can't ignore the 12 targets. I do expect Brady to get going a little bit more with Mike Evans. He took a step forward in that direction, and obviously Godwin had the touchdown last week. As a #3 receiver from Tom Brady, hopefully, fingers crossed, they throw enough against Arizona where Gage can come through. But I'm a little bit encouraged by what I saw from Gage to use as a low-end #3 receiver in full PPR.
And does have 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games as well, so just keep an eye on Julio Jones and that injury. Tight ends that we're looking at to add, Juwan Johnson, Chig Okonkwo, Noah Fant. Those are the 3 I think that you should have the most interest in. Johnson's just has done a fantastic job finding the end zone. So when it comes to Johnson and his matchup against Cleveland, weather could be awful there, but it's hard to overlook the production. So do you have any interest in Johnson this week?
I do. He's a high-end #2 tight end for me this week. I had a lot of interest in Johnson before I saw the forecast in Cleveland, which just looks absolutely miserable. I'm not sure there will be 25 combined pass attempts in that game, but he is certainly the most likely Saint to get targeted in the end zone. And so you're just banking on that touchdown production. If you're looking for a touchdown or bust tight end, there's no better touchdown or bust option than Juwan Johnson.
Dave, when it comes to Chig Okonkwo, we've seen the last 3 games have been very productive. Last week not as exciting as the 2 games prior to that, but if Treylon Burks does return in a game where they're going to probably run a lot, is Okonkwo now off the table as a streaming option?
He might be off the table even if Burks doesn't play because I expect the Titans to run the ball a ton against the Texans. But here's the good news about Okonkwo. He's seen at least 5 targets in 4 straight games, at least 9 PPR fantasy points in each of his past 3. The Texans have allowed at least 11 PPR points to a tight end in 4 of their past 7 games. So it is a good matchup for him. I'm just a little bit nervous about how many opportunities there will actually be for him. If Burks is back, I'm out on Okonkwo. And even if Burks is gone, like I said, still a low-end starter.
And you have a hobbled Ryan Tannehill as well, so dealing with that ankle, he's going to play, but who knows how successful he'll be. Heath, one story we really haven't spent a lot of time talking about, but it's a big one, is Tyler Lockett not playing. He's going to be out with the finger injury. So Noah Fant scored last week. You got Marquise Goodwin, who could see a benefit as well. So we know DK Metcalf will get his numbers. I'm sure they'll lean on Kenneth Walker, but without Lockett there, what do you think about Fant? What do you think about Goodwin against the Chiefs?
I think Fant is a high-end #2 tight end that if he scores a touchdown, he's going to have a good day. I'm actually pretty interested in Marquise Goodwin. I think he can slide into that #2 wide receiver role and possibly earn 7 to 8 targets against a pretty good matchup against the Chiefs, where they'll be chasing the score, so there could be 40-plus pass attempts. for Geno Smith. I like Goodwin as a number 3 wide receiver this week.
And Goodwin, for what it's worth, has 5 games on the season with at least 5 targets. 2 of those games, he's gone over 20 PPR points. So when he's gotten featured a little bit in the offense, he has the chance for some big games, as Heath will say, a good boomer bust number 3 wide receiver.